It was a gift from the Ukrainians. No one saw it coming. Their valor, their ingenuity, their willingness to defend their piece of the earth was a gift to us in our China policy, and it continues to do that. What some people are calling expenditure is actually an investment in our prosperity and security, because you're a lot stronger with friends and allies than you are when your friends and allies are moving in another direction. There's a wedge between you and your friends and allies. I think we got lucky here. We heard a lot about the pivot to Asia, a phrase that was a little bit unfortunate that came out of the Obama administration because it implied that we weren't there, when of course the United States' involvement of Asia goes back a very long way, and it's been part of our prosperity and our way of life for some time to have deep connections to Asia. So the pivot to Asia idea was that, yes, Europe was less important. Yes, Europe was rich and should take care of itself. Yes, Asia was the future. And yes, we needed to invest more there. And then the Ukraine war comes. That is to say, Russia has a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They've already bitten off big pieces of Ukraine in 2014, for which I think we slapped both Putin's wrists, not just one wrist. And after those slaps on the wrist, he went and decided he wanted to take the whole thing. We discovered that his invasion of Ukraine and Xi Jinping's support, mostly rhetorical, but nonetheless support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, turned the Europeans into questioning whether they were too close to China or not. The beauty of Xi Jinping's strategy, which he inherited, was that there was a wedge between Europe and the United States on China policy. The U.S. was going to be hostile. The U.S., according to China, couldn't abide China's rise. The U.S. was going to hold China down any way it could. But the Europeans, well, they hate conflict, they love trade, and so for them, they were going to differentiate themselves from the U.S. by not having a hostile China policy. And that worked for a while for the Chinese, and then Xi Jinping just blew it up. He decided to throw his weight behind an invasion of a sovereign country on European soil. And the Europeans said, wait a minute, maybe our China policy shouldn't be so distant from the U.S. Maybe the U.S. was right about China. Maybe we have to be wary of our dependence on China. Maybe we have to reconsider some of the trade pacts where China doesn't abide by international norms or international rules. Maybe, in other words, this is a wake-up call. Now, I could even add here that something similar happened in the case of Japan. Japan, which is probably the country, maybe the only country, that understands deeply both the United States and China, having a long entangled history with China going back, and now being an ally of the United States after that devastating defeat in the war. Japan, too, began to rethink its China policy and how close it needed to be to China versus how close it needed to be to the U.S. on Asian strategic questions. To a great extent in Europe and to a lesser extent in East Asia, it turned out that the pivot to Asia went through the transatlantic alliance. The stronger the transatlantic alliance got, the stronger China policy got. The more our allies came on side, the more that we weren't moving unilaterally against China. So the horror of the Ukraine war, and it is a horror, they are fighting and dying right now as you and I sit here comfortably speaking. The horror of the Ukraine war delivered a bounty to us on China policy. What some people are calling expenditure is actually an investment in our prosperity and security, because you're a lot stronger with friends and allies than you are when your friends and allies are moving in another direction. There's a wedge between you and your friends and allies. And so I think we got lucky here. This was not a policy. We did not sit around in the Situation Room or how are we going to manage this China stuff? We'll have to reinvigorate the alliances. We'll have to reinvigorate our relationships with our friends. That's how we're going to do it. It was a gift from the Ukrainians. No one saw it coming. Their valor, their ingenuity, their willingness to defend their piece of the earth was a gift to us in our China policy, and it continues to do that. First, we have to acknowledge that Europe is an enormous success. That's why it's good to be friends with them.
The European Union?
Europe as a whole is an enormous success. They're a bunch of very rich countries. For the most part, they have rule of law and stable constitutional systems. They democratized over time, just like the United States did. More and more people got the right to vote there. And their peace and prosperity is deep. It's in values terms. It's not something that is easily sloughed off by this election or that election or this economic crisis or whatever have you. And so they are a success. Now, we can talk about the European Union. We live here in a country where the left loves the European Union, and yet they won't let us teach Western civilization on a college campus. Western civilization is evil to them, and yet they love the European Union. And then the right, they detest the European Union, and yet they want Western civilization to be taught on the college campus. So it's a very strange situation that we find ourselves in. Western civilization, one side won't let us have it, and the other side can't abide it. And yet they're connected. There are many, many issues with the European Union that the Europeans would like to fix, and they can't because of all the issues that you know. Our friends in Britain got out of the European Union in a process that we have to wait and see in the fullness of time what that's going to look like. But it doesn't look very successful now because it was a club, for all its faults, of highly rich, successful, rule of law, democratic, prosperous countries. And so you'd want to be in that club. There are other clubs you could join, and they're not so good. They have some of the same bureaucratic nightmares without the prosperity and the rule of law. So let's acknowledge that Europe is a success. Let's also acknowledge that bringing in our friends in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet satellites, has done wonders for Europe. It's changed the tone to a very great extent, both in security terms and just in wider terms of who has a voice, who should have a voice, what's the center of gravity in Europe, and how should Europe operate. That story is also still unfolding. Sure, some of the countries are small, but Poland is not a small country. It's changed the religious makeup of Europe a little bit because some of the countries that came in are more religious than some of the countries that were there. So Europe is an unfolding project with much disappointment, but overall it's packed. It's a club of very successful countries, and its dynamic is shifting a little bit because of its enlargement, and the same goes for the NATO story.